So we have two different auth forms in the app. We have this login form and the register form, both of which are displayed from the same view, which is the auth view. I've got that one open here now. The thing is that whenever we enter this view, we're going to need to create a new user model instance that can be used by either the login or register form to manage the form data. Now obviously a new model instance will need an ID, but before the user is actually retrieved from the server, we don't know their real ID. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a temporary ID. Now I've actually already created that in our constants file up here. So you'll see I've got one here, temp user ID. It's just got a string value. It doesn't matter what that value is. But the reason I've made it a constant is that we can now use that globally across other components to refer to this same temporary user instance that's being used in our form here. So coming back to the auth view, let's go ahead and import that constant. And we're already importing some other constants, so I'm just going to add it to the list of constants here. So this one's temp user ID, like that. And now we can use that in this component. So let's go ahead and create a new user model instance here. So first thing we're going to have to do is import the user model. So we're going to go import user from store models user. Now we're going to use a created hook in this component. And the first thing that we're going to do is check if a temporary user model already exists, because we only ever want one. So we're going to go if not, user find, user find, and we pass in the temporary user ID. So why might the temporary user model already exist? Well, consider the case where the user may have logged into the app and then they've logged out and they're trying to log in again, and they've done that all in the same app session. Well, in that case, the model may have already been created. So, all right, what we're going to do is, if we don't find the model, we now want to create it, and we can do that by going user create. And of course, we need to pass an object to this in order to define the user that we want to create here. So we're going to put a data property, and that's going to have an ID, and that's going to be the temp user ID. Now, of course, all the other fields in this model are just going to be their default blank values, because the real data is obviously going to come from the form. So here we now have on screen the login form component. And this one is a child of the auth view that we were just looking at. Now in the login form is where we have our inputs. So you can see this component input email, and this one here input password. Now both of these receive props. They receive an ID prop, and they also receive a model prop. And we're going to come back and talk about those props in just a moment. For now, let's just go ahead and take a look at one of those input components. So this is the input email component. And you'll see in the template that all it's really doing is being a wrapper for this component here, which is a Vuetify component, vText field. And what that does is it's simply an HTML input wrapped inside a Vuetify component. So the relevant part to this component that I want to talk about now is we have a V model, and the value that we've assigned to it is just called value. Now looking at the component definition down here, you don't actually see a local data property or prop called value, and that's because it comes from a mixin. So you'll see we have this input mixin there, and I've created that in order to be able to reuse logic across all our different form inputs. So let's now jump over to the to the mixin, and you can see that value is set here, and it's actually a computed property. And it's a computed property with getters and setters. Now, hopefully you'll recall from the last module of the course that we use getters and setters whenever we need a two-way binding between an input and the Vuex store. So starting with the getter here, firstly it uses the model prop and it uses the ID prop. As we said before, these will come from the login form component. Now the model prop, it's going to be a Vuex ORM model that's associated with this input, and the ID will be the ID of the model instance that we want to bind to. Now we also need this name property here, and you'll notice that's not a prop and it's not defined locally. That's because it needs to be defined in the component that consumes the mixin. So if we jump back to, where is it, our email input, you'll see that's where we've defined the name. And in this case, we've set that to email. All right, so coming back to the mixin now, let's see if we can make sense of what this getter actually does. So assume that the model here is our user model, and assume that the ID here is the temp user ID, and let's also assume that the name is the string email. Then at runtime, what this line should actually look like is return user. If we replace this .model with user, and then it would be find, and instead of this .id, it's going to be temp user ID, and then the dynamic property here is going to be email. So that's what that line should look like at runtime. And what that basically means is that this getter is returning the email property of the temporary user instance that we've created in our auth view. Now the final piece of this puzzle is the auth form mixin, which I've got displayed here now. So this mixin gets added to both the login and registration forms, and this is where the ID and model values are set, and those get passed down as props to all the inputs in these forms. So you'll see that currently ID and model, they're local data properties. ID is just a blank string, and model is this little mocked class that I've created up here. Now we want the ID to be the temporary user model ID for the auth form. So what we want to do is we're going to go to the top and we're going to import that constant, temp user ID, and that's going to come from our constants file. Then we're going to import the user model as well. So we're going to go import user from store models user. So that means we can now come down and replace this ID here with the temp user ID, and we can replace the model with user, and we can just delete this little mocked model that I put there. The only reason I actually included that is that if we didn't have some kind of valid model associated here, the app wouldn't have compiled. So I just put it there temporarily until we've replaced it with something that we actually want to use. So that's all we need to do to link this form and its input children to the Vuex store, and specifically to the user model. In order to test if the form has now been set up correctly, you're going to have to comment out the VueAuth plugin installation in the main.js file, because it's going to give us runtime errors due to some missing config that we're going to be dealing with in the next few videos. So you just want to temporarily comment that out. So with all that done, we're not going to yet have a working login form, but what we do have is a user model that is now reactively linked to the inputs of this login form. So let's test that assumption and enter some data. And if I come down to the Vuex tab and we look at the current state, and we look inside the users entity and inside the data in there, you can see we have a user here with the ID user_ID, And you'll see that the email is the data that I just put into the form, and the password is the same data that I put into the form. So that tells us that we've got these correctly set up. In the next video, we're going to use this model data as part of the form submission.